So the last time I was up for Toda.Day, I'd had the pleasure of talking about, just a couple of months before that, doing the very first commercial transaction on Toda, which included getting my mom a manicure and pedicure while I was flying around in a plane. And sometimes it helps to think about where we started. The start was actually quite a bit before this. Tufi and Dan can give you a much more detailed history, but I just picked a point in time. And what you're looking at is April of 2017. 4 people in a rented room, and Adam and Dan are about 2 minutes after that photo was taken, walk through the very first transaction of a file on Toda, going from one node to the next. And TodaQ had just started as a company then. Before that, it was just a bunch of people working for about a year, just with a dream. But the company had just been incorporated, and now 19 months has passed. Where is TodaQ, and where is STAR, which is a strategic Toda Note asset reserve? So I wanted to talk a little bit about what are some of the main entities in the ecosystem. And over time, this is going to get much bigger, much more complicated, much more colorful. But at least at the start, for everyone who's building solutions in the room, sometimes it helps to just pull out a few things so you can look and see who's doing what and what's their purpose. So out of the 4 entities here, the 4 at the top, or the 2 at the top, are the nonprofit entities. And from what you've heard so far, Toda as a data ownership management and transfer protocol, it's efficient enough that it doesn't need an integral coin or token or asset that the protocol knows and that's needed in order to transact and to settle. And in fact, if you put that in it, you would cripple it. You'd make the whole thing far weaker. Because imagine if you had something that could hold value and allow for these peer-to-peer transactions, and there was something embedded in it, like Ether or a Bitcoin or a Lumen or what have you, and you showed up at a country, at a society, at a market and said, hey, here's the best thing since sliced bread, but to use it, you have to use our little widget or whatever you want to call it. And the first thing that would happen is that minister or that CEO would turn and say, this looks really cool. And then they would turn to their smart people or their engineers and say, how can you free me from the need to go through the river or the toll booth that the group is putting in front of me? And that, in fact, is exactly what is happening with Ethereum and with all of the other blockchains. Probably in the last month, I've spoken with almost 10 major companies that took a devil's choice and decided to hard fork Ethereum or something else. And even knowing that in doing that and going to a private blockchain, they weren't going to get any of the trust or efficiency benefits, but they did it nonetheless. So in this particular case, the 2 organizations you're seeing at the top, one is obviously TRI, which is the Toda Research Institute, which is there to steward the open source protocol. And the other one is STAR, which is the Strategic Toda Note Asset Reserve. And the Toda Note was that very first digital asset that was placed on Toda. But it's a choice. It's there to monetize the entire ecosystem, to allow for the production and trade in more goods and services in the real economy on Toda. But people and businesses have a choice of whether they want to use it. And to the extent it adds value, people will, but they don't have to. And a lot of that is embedded in sort of the whole philosophy of what Toda is. So there's those 2 organizations, and on the bottom, you've got Toda.Network and then TodaQ. And TodaQ is really designed as a bank of the future, really just to do 2 things. And to do those 2 things for large enterprise companies, particularly those that were providing what I'd call essential services, retail, communications, energy, pharmaceuticals, education, all the things that are essential to having us live and operate in a society. And then the second group is banks, and then the third group is smart cities. On the city side, right now we've got quite a few billion people in cities. In the next couple of decades, the equivalent of the population of Earth today will all be living in cities. And we are adding cities at a rate of 1 Shanghai every quarter. That's how quickly we're urbanizing. So those are the three constituents that TodaQ serves, and it really just provides two things. The first is a Toda as a service base level blockchain so that all the assets, all the money, all the transactions can go on that. The Toda protocol itself is free, but the value that TodaQ provides in doing that is a plug-and-play, easy solution for businesses in these organizations, so that the backup, the integration into their ERP and AI systems, the ability to have a management view and control and steward the things that are going on inside, all of that is presented as a combined package, and that's where the value is. And then the second thing that TodaQ provides is finance, insurance, and other services to enable trade on Toda for those organizations and for all the small, medium businesses and consumers that surround them. The interesting part about that is Toda.Network and TodaQ are very, very synergistic. Because while we're providing that base for all of our customers, there's a whole lot of context between that base level TodaQ as a service and the finance and insurance services. If we go out to a pharmaceutical company and put their operations and supply and distribution chain onto that, there's a bunch of things on top where suddenly records and analytics and ERP systems and all those things become important, which means that a lot of the projects and JVs and startups that are being created within Toda.Network have a place within the TodaQ distribution and customer pipeline. So every single time I'm here, I'm looking with great interest at all of those projects, because as we're going out to all of these customers, there's probably about 100% of them that have clearly identified a need for at least 2/3 of the projects that are being talked about today. And that little Kuretsu line is just showing co-ownership and a bit of the linking there. So where's TodaQ and Star 19 months later? It actually amazes me. Day to day, I feel impatient that we could do better, that we could do more, that we could do it faster. But it's like you're climbing a hill. Your lungs are burning, your legs are dead and feel like lead, and all you see is ground and dust under your feet. But every time you stop and you look back, you start to see what everyone has managed to do. In this case, the team grew from those original few folks in the room to now 27 full-time, between engineering, product development, business development, those on the market, on the exchange side, as well as actuarial scientists, economists, and the like. And a really fantastic set of folks. I've also been extremely pleased that the team has been augmented by our investors and by our enterprise customers. And they've also started pitching in. The advisory group has been much the same. They extend from Korea all the way through Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. They're in government. They're in the C-suites of corporations, including AT&T, Goldman Sachs. They sit on the planning boards of smart cities and everything else. And the nice part is all of those brains and all of those insights have really been instrumental in improving the solution and improving our execution on it. And all of that came with a ton of effort. If I think about how many hours and how much sweat was put in by folks, and the really nice part about it is they came in and just started shoveling without really asking or sorting out any particular partnership. And sometimes that discussion would happen 2 or 3 months after we'd been hammering away for a while. Now the nice part about that is we've got probably about 200 plus nodes just on the main net all around the world, where we've been doing both commercial and test transactions continuously to make sure that the whole thing was stable. But the even more exciting part is, where are we going? And in 2019, that couple of 100,000 effort hours that went into TodaQ and Star, we're looking at that being over 1 million next year. And those 200, I'm kind of laughing now, and I'm just watching Dan's expression too, because, we had a plan, and, they have a saying about plans and contact with the enemy and not surviving. So I created a really nice page, and the page was like, okay, we're going to go from 100 accounts, then we're going to have 1,000, then 10,000, and then we're going to have 100,000, and then we'll get to 1 million. And along the way, we're going to do testing and all these nice things. Anyway, so we signed our first contract this fall. We've got 3 more lined up. And one of them showed up and said, right, we want you to deliver a digital media and online news portal, and we're going to throw on 5 million people, and we're going to do it in Q2. And we're like, oh, all right. And then you just have to adapt. So that is a little bit of the kinds of things we can't predict. But I think, like most early stage companies, you get 2 problems. There's one where you're trying to get the car started. The other is it's going and you're trying to keep the wheels from flying off. You're going to have one or the other problem, and I'd rather have the second. The contracts that and the partners that we're currently working with, that spreads, and really the main countries right now are Korea, Thailand, the UAE and the Middle East, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Canada, and Romania. And over that time, we've also had a lot of investor partners and others that have come in to support the whole effort, over 40 in total since the beginning. We raised about 2 million or so in what I'll call the pre-seed funding. We're just in the middle of closing an equity round this month for 5 and change. And into next year, we'll be doing much more in order to provide fuel for everything we're executing against. So that is 19 months in 1 page. So out of the 2 things that TodaQ does, you can see the Toda as a service there. I won't talk about that very much. What I wanted to do was dive into one transaction, because I figure if we can understand one commercial transaction, that's great. We'll know where the value is. And then we can ask the question, well, how do we multiply this times 1 billion? What do we have to believe? So if you look on the right, you can see a seller and a buyer, and we'll look at something pretty simple, like buying a car. And our buyer and seller, they're just 2 nodes, and they just need to be connected on the cell phone network and have other nodes or gardeners there. So the seller has a car, and you can see the ownership and registration file that is there, and the buyer has cash. And right now what they're going to do is an atomic swap transaction, which we can do on Toda. And you know that usually in any kind of commercial or merchant transaction, we always have the show me the goods, show me the money problem. So that is the source of most of the plots for Hollywood, Bollywood, and every other movie. And it also is the reason why 80% of the finance and insurance world exists. Out of the possible outcomes with that transaction, the buyer might not get the car, the seller might not get the money, they might get some of the car, some of the money, or they might get money that they didn't expect or bargain for, or a different kind of car, or a host of other possibilities. And all of that counterparty and trade risk is the thing that then leads to trade finance, escrow, insurance services, that whole raft of things that are there to deal with. How do I know that I'm going to get the goods if I give you the money, or that I'm going to get the money if I'm giving you the goods, right? And that problem. So in the atomic swap, the 2-way transaction just becomes one. And there's only 2 possibilities. The buyer gets the car and the seller gets all the money, or they keep their car and they keep the money, and that's it. And everything else goes away. And that means that apart from transaction fees, a whole bunch of other intermediary services, waste, and expense disappears. I think one of the things, and everyone has seen this before, that when new technology comes out, we fall in love with it, which is necessary. But sometimes there's a danger of seeing that it's going to do everything from make a coffee for you, as well as cure cancer. And there's things that the blockchain does and does not do. So let's see where's the places where we continue to have risk that is left. And then that means that there is services and a business opportunity and value to be provided in the market. So the first is, if you look on the side of the seller, that ownership and registration connects to something physical, which is an actual car. And a lot of guarantees can be provided on Toda, but it doesn't tell you, was that car in a car crash a minute before the transaction took place? Did the seller own a pet which scratched up the back seat? And 1,000 other possibilities. It doesn't help you with that, and it's not meant to. So in this particular case, if you're asking what kind of insurance services is TodaQ looking at, it's the insurance services that are there to handle that leftover risk. So in this particular case, if you had an asset, whether it was a car or inventory or things in the supply chain or whatever else, now you can actually bind the insurance policy file to the digital ownership file, which then takes care of the buyer's counterparty risk. If we go onto the side of the buyer, they have money, but until the Bank of International Settlements and the central banks go onto Toda or something equivalent, any fiat currencies or money that is put onto Toda has to have a treasury and audit and custodial solution, which means that in an enterprise's environment or a company's environment, let's say they have a US or a Canadian dollar that is floating around on Toda, it means somewhere in a bank, there needs to be another equivalent dollar that is sitting there, because the settlement, because we haven't switched the entire world over completely, is still functioning in the old world. In that particular case, that set of custodial, treasury, and audit solutions is the next set of things that TodaQ provides, particularly because the customers in this case are large enterprises and corporates. And then the final one, if you look on that top right where it says loan, one of the problems the buyer might have is they just don't have the money or the cash with them. So in this particular case, providing funding directly onto Toda provides a whole bunch of advantages. But I did that just so that everyone had a chance, just with one transaction, to see where are the advantages and what's left over, and how does TodaQ in a very simple way fit into that. So let's now then step to that first solution or service that TodaQ created, which was the TodaQ API. And that's actually what Records on Toda, as an example, is using to build their solution on top of. So I'm going to get Dan Tolliver, and he's going to talk through some of the basics of what this is and what it provides.
Hey everyone, I wanted to tell you about TodaQ's API because I'm super excited about the work that the team there is doing on this. So one way to think of the Toda protocol is that it gives you meaningful digital assets. That means that it gives you digital assets that you can think of and treat like physical assets. So you own that, you have real possession of it, you can give it away, you can loan it, you can rent it, you can sell it. And when you do that, you don't have to go through any intermediaries. You can do that directly. So as Hassan was saying, it's directly between the buyer and the seller in the case of the car and the money. So that's very simple. But it turns out that's not actually very easy to implement because you have to do a whole bunch of cryptographic stuff. You have to kind of understand a lot of things. You have to build a bunch of stuff. So very simple, not very easy. TodaQ's Toda as a Service API makes it very easy to use the Toda protocol. So what it allows you to do is to send RESTful HTTPS-based requests to TodaQ's Toda as a Service API, you can create accounts there, which are then associated with addresses under the hood, but you don't have to worry about the addresses. You're just thinking of this as accounts. You can do transactions between those. You can create files. So in particular, this is really geared toward enterprises. If you're an enterprise, you probably have various kinds of files that you are interested in creating. These could be, for example, loyalty points, reward points, things like that. They could be, I don't know, electronic video game assets. They could be certifications for the different kinds of products that you have. You can create these just by sending HTTP API requests to the TodaQ Toda as a Service server. You can then distribute those to your end users. And the interesting thing about this is, if you were doing this in a centralized system, you would then need to trust TodaQ to do this. TodaQ is managing these addresses for you. It's managing those assets for you. But because it's built on the Toda protocol, you don't actually have to trust TodaQ. Because what happens is that TodaQ is managing these assets, but it can only do things with them if the owner of that asset says that TodaQ can do something with that. So who is the owner of that asset? Is it TodaQ? No. Is it the enterprise? Well, if the enterprise has created some of these loyalty points and hasn't given them out yet, then yes, they are the owner. But once they give them out, it's actually the end user who receives that, who is the owner. And so what we want then is to have strong ownership that goes all the way from that end user through the enterprise, through TodaQ, down into the Toda protocol, and binds a key pair that that end user creates on their mobile device, on their phone, for example, into that asset itself, so that that asset cannot be transferred or acted on in any way without a signature from that key pair. So what that means is that while TodaQ is managing all of these assets, you still get the full trust factors that you get from a decentralized system, and you get that with a very inefficient, clean API in front of it that makes it really easy to integrate into your enterprise. So I'm super excited about this. We've got quite a few of the Toda.Network JVs using it. So Records on Toda, for example, the live demo that you saw earlier was backed by this. It's very efficient. It's very easy to use. Makes me happy. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Tim. All right, so now let's blow it up a billion times. Well, we're close, but we're not quite there yet. What you're looking at is most of TodaQ's pipeline, but not all of it. In this particular case, we've got a whole set of enterprise companies, smart cities, as well as banks. And if I just kind of go through it pretty quickly, within Korea, we're launching our first shared economy contract. The first stage will throw 10,000 residents, all their integrated services surrounding merchants, onto the blockchain. That company is scaling that thing out to 1 million residents, and in their larger customer pipeline, there's about another 10 million there. With our Middle Eastern client, we're going out into the oil and gas space and putting the entire supply chain inventory and oil and gas on it as well. They're also working with us so that the TodaQ Toda as a Service API gets full ERP integration into SAP, Oracle, Odoo, and all the other services. A number of smart city ones. On the financial institution side, that's a global universal bank with presence in 80 countries. So we'll be doing the first proof of concept there to replace SWIFT as a global system. The education end, that's the world's largest private education company. And there it's around putting course content, student enrollment, and all the activities onto the blockchain. And on top of that, doing an AI integration in order to provide free AI TA-assisted STEM training to students in a whole number of markets. It keeps going. I could probably sit here for about 25 minutes and talk through all of it. The nice part is that even with the existing partner enterprises and investors, that gets us to a pipeline of around 50 million customers on the B2C side, not counting the business-to-business end. Then on the star end, that's really with the Toda Note, which should matter to everyone because you're all getting it. The Toda Note, you can think of that as a backstopped digital note where its generation, it gets pushed out to every single business, consumer, and organization that is building on Toda. It's governed by the strategic Toda Note Asset Reserve, which is a foundation and trust nonprofit, designed to make sure that it gets out into the entire Toda ecosystem. There's a number of elements to this. One in particular I talked about, just because I was talking about our enterprise partners, is we've already got about close to half a dozen of those large companies on board to act as partners in pushing it out into their commercial environments. So not only is the Toda Note available for use within the development and R&D environments or in all the projects that are building things, it's going to be directly pushed out to merchants and consumers across all of these large companies and to that larger distribution. So it's both there to build the ecosystem as well as hit the real economy, and right now we've got a pipeline into over half a dozen countries to push it. As a quick note, just to show you, this is the sharing economy example. So that first complex of 10,000 residents, that's it over there. And the services is everything from daycare that you see on the right over there, healthcare services, physical fitness, grocery and small merchants, restaurants, schools that are all inside that. So it's almost like a microcosm of a smart city. I wanted to talk quickly about, just because we talked about donations, records, and land before this, about where some of the contexts were on our end were very, very interested. So if I start on the left with donations, you can see some of the photos just at the top there that's showing Bill Clinton, Sonny Varkey, and the Varkey Foundation. That is the foundation end of GEMS Education, which is one of our investors, and we're actually going to be deploying through them. And then there's a number of others beneath that that's actually TodaQ, where we are funding and sponsoring both a European football club as well as a United Nations-backed effort in order to protect our space heritage. But in all of those, the donations solution has context and meaning to be placed on top of what we're doing and be brought through to there. On the side of records, what you're seeing at the top is Shalina Healthcare, which is Africa's affordable healthcare and generic pharmaceuticals leader. They, again, are another investor of ours. In this case, the deployment is through their operations, distribution, and supply chain, but again, around patient records. That is one particular context that we're looking at where the need is there. This one is for Songnam Smart City, and this one is for GEMS, which is an oil and gas client. In each of those cases, the records application has a use and a broad distribution. The reason why on the TodaQ end we care is that we have a very specific and standardized business model. And there's a whole set of things that become very what I'll call domain or sector specific that we are just not there as part of our brain damage to figure out. And finally, looking at land, with STAR, there's 2 to the 37 or 137 billion Toda Notes that are going out globally. We're bringing investors to build the initial part of the backstop that sits underneath using SDR currencies, but that overall asset reserve will be composed of precious metals as well as land, which is why the direct application again for us is there in 2019. So, whether it's in this event or, through the rest of the year and into 2019, like I said, the more that can be done, the faster, the bigger, the better, the happier we are on our end, because it has a use and it has a commercial place. Thank you.